I hit a button on here instead, because I've got two programs running on my screen. You see, one to do the presentation. So hopefully now it's coming through. I mustn't touch that. So if you see my hand going towards the slap it, so yeah, don't touch. So I have to do it on here. So I'm going to just give a little bit more of the geographical detail, because it is interesting how there have the area that we looked at, which, as I said, may have been a surprise for folks. It's probably further north than people have traditionally seen the Red Sea being crossed. But if just a verse or so before, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, so they should turn back and encamp." And I've highlighted some places before Pihahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, before Baal Zephon, and they shall encamp opposite, which is probably Baal Pihahiroth, by the sea. And so on that little map there, I've just highlighted a number of those locations. So you can see the Pah-Tufeh, which is which means the reeds. That's Egyptian for the reeds, and that's what they called that big lake, which we identified as being part of the Sea of Reeds that runs all the way down, and then the Red Sea becomes the Sea of Reeds because the Sea of Reeds runs all the way down to it. So it's the inland lakeways that no longer exist, but they did in Moses' day, that push right up towards the Mediterranean that the Israelites crossed. And Baal Zephon has got that little location with the red dot there. You can see on the map just to the. So it's between Migdol, and you can see a place called Migdol on the far side, and Baal Zephon, and they'll encamp opposite Pihahiroth, which is just there. I put that. Now, how do we know those names? You see, because it's easy to put a map and put names on them. And a lot of Bible maps are exactly that, is people don't exactly know where somewhere is, so they put a dot in roughly the right place. But Baal Zephon is located, is identified almost universally as being Tapenes, because although it wasn't called that in Moses' day, if you remember, a number of the place names in the Bible are not what they were called in Moses' day, because the Bible was kind of first drawn together in the form we have it, although it was working with older documents in the days of Jeremiah. And so therefore that we find the kind of, if you like, the names that were given to places are the names by which they're known by at the time that they'd be drawing that story together. And because you might instantly realize why Baal Zephon isn't an Egyptian name, because obviously it's a Phoenician name, because it's got the name Baal in it. And you remember the god Baal, who's regularly there in the early days, is actually a Phoenician, and then he pushes his way into Canaanite thinking along the coastline, the god of those areas. As the Phoenicians kind of were coming in and trading, they were using, you see the lagoon here, the lagoon area, they were using this area and the sea, and there's some natural protection there, and they would bring their trading ships down to into that kind of corner of Egypt as they came down the kind of the coastline of the Mediterranean and crossing into Egypt. And so they established kind of quite an important sort of staging post, and they erected a major shrine to the god Baal, Baal Zephon as he's referred to, at this location. And we read about it right the way from the 6th century BC. The Phoenician documents refer to the god of Baal Zephon and all the gods of Tapenes. It's referring to the same place. So Egyptian Tapenes becomes the Phoenician name Baal Zephon, which is referred to here. So it's some way past that, and it's before Migdol, and that Migdol, well, some of you will recognise because it's very similar to the Hebrew word for a tower, which we think of as in Magdal, from which Mary Magdalene gets her name, tower. And there's actually a run of fortifications, and it's part of, if you like, the way, because of the waterways that ran all the way down to Suez, part of the way that Egypt could control the inflow of people from Asia and Arabia into Egypt was by channeling them all up to this narrow land bridge at the top, and the Migdol there was a key guarding point at the thin point. See where the lagoon comes in, and before the canal. Do you see the blue line, which is the canal that we talked about? Which is the last top end of the canal that was built to join all of these waterways together to create a kind of a wall of water between Egypt and the rest of the world. And so that location of Migdol has been identified by looking at old Egyptian documents that have runs of names of the forts. And if you take the forts, several of them have been excavated, and that looks like where it should be. The only problem is they can't excavate it at the moment because it's an extremely successful fruit farm business. And it has had loads of imported topsoil dumped in it. So it's very difficult to see anything, and they won't allow anybody to come and dig it up because they have established fruit trees and so on and so forth. But is understood by archaeologists who have kind of worked their way through the various fortifications that this is where it should be in this run of things. So that's thought to be where Migdol is. And the Pahir Kiroth is Hebrew for the mouth of the cutting or mouth of the gorge. So I've put the Strong's number there. And just to kind of say, you remember we've looked at the reason why I take a view that Mount Sinai is in Arabia is primarily because the descriptions of it, which we'll look at again tonight, do match very well with the kind of they're having some active volcano activity with it. But there are one of the other things is that actually when it comes to the etymology of names and why they're called the way they are, it fits far better in this region. But it's always possible to make an argument the other way. So if you do see the Gulf of Akbara as being the place where the children of Israel cross, the Pahir Kiroth, which means the mouth of the cutting or the mouth of the gorge, is often argued, well, there's some kind of cliff edges there, and they perhaps thought of that cliff edge as it's not what we think of as a gorge that comes with two sides, but maybe that's a cutting, it's a cut-off cliff. But we don't have any evidence it was called that. That's really coming and looking at the odd geography and trying to find something that would look like it was the cutting. Does that make sense? But the word cutting actually becomes the word canal. Because a canal you kind of dig out or you cut out of the ground. Does that make sense? And in actual fact, the Egyptians actually, I think I've got this on the next slide. Is it on the next slide? Have I just... No, I haven't this time.
Are these additional ones? Because we haven't got these.
Are they not in there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So they were in there because I did the...
That must have been that issue that we were having. But I definitely took the one...
The 603, yeah. Okay, so sorry if you got these slides missing. So you have to just pay attention to the screen now instead. We'll have to kind of get them to you another way. So the have I got? Yes, there we go. I've got down here. So actually, the Egyptian texts refer to this region or of that little last bit of the canal as Par Kara, which is Egyptian for the canal, and Kara comes from the same root word as the Kiroth, which technically comes from a root word means to dig out or to cut out, and eventually becomes, as time develops and people get better at waterways, becomes the word for a canal, even in Hebrew. And so actually it's very, Par HaKiroth means, they call it Par Kara, which means the, Egyptian for Par is the, Kara is the canal. But in Hebrew, Par is the word for face, or Pi, Pa. The panim, if you remember, sorry, I'm saying you remember. if you've ever kind of tried to read through a kind of a Hebrew interlinear, you'll come across, the word that we translate as presence of God is actually the word for the faces of God. It's panim, and it's the pa bit is the face bit. You see, so they took the pa and they heard it as the mouth and thought, well, it's the mouth of the canal. So Pahir Kiroth is the mouth of the canal. They call it just simply Par Kara, the Egyptians. So, which makes sense because actually, if you take a point about midway between Migdol and Bar Zephon, actually you are on the edge of the Reed Sea or the Reeds, Par Tufti, and you're kind of looking across at the mouth of the canal. Does that make sense? So, can you see how the etymology of the words or the roots of the word actually fit the geography of that location? And actually, just on the very far right hand edge of that screen as you're looking at it, past Migdol, you can see a bit of a blob. What they did with the canal is it runs downstream from the Par, from the Tufti, from the Reed Sea, it runs downstream and into a kind of a natural dip where it created an artificial oasis. So if you think about this, 3,000 years ago, the Egyptians had created an artificial kind of oasis by their hydrography, which is just at the end of that there. So that's the place, as we thought, where if it was with the east wind coming, and where we've got precedent for this kind of thing happening, where the east wind can drive back the sea, it would drive it effectively, an east wind would drive it effectively south just because of the way it works. So the northern end, effectively, because of the way it kind of deepens down in the south, is probably where they've crossed. That's the way we've understood it. And as we're going to see, there's a nice fit for the things that come next. So Moses has gone through, the Israelites have gone through, and we get now to what is one of two parts of Scripture that is kind of universally by those who take a less historical view. So you've got to hear it with that. Those who don't take such a strong historical view of Scripture, all of them say that what comes next and the Song of Deborah are probably the oldest. They think of them as being the oldest pieces of extant written text in the world. There's nothing kind of, well, yeah, and the reason they think that is because they're songs and there's a certain structure to the song. They think they've never been changed. You get that? So while we might have a story from the Bible that claims to be similar period, but the trouble is it's gone through editing, etc., etc. That's how they argue it. But when you've got a song, it's probably stayed the way it should do, because you can show things in the structure and so on. And so the song of worship that they sing, and I like just to flag it because, you know, we might take a slightly different view from them as a foundation thing, but just to say when we're looking at this, everybody agrees this is really, really ancient. So there's even those who don't believe in the miracles, who don't believe in the Exodus, they actually think this song is incredibly, incredibly ancient. So it's just quite a nice thing to kind of remember. And similarly, they think the same with the Song of Deborah in the Book of Judges. I was about to hit stop recording again. I've got to, we are still going at the moment. I've not done it. I'm keeping an eye on it now. And the nice thing is, Jesus actually kind of appears in Moses' song. I've touched on this before, but I thought we might as well bring it out a little bit, seeing as we're covering it. So they come out on the other side of the Sea of Reeds. They said, "I'll sing to the Lord, for His triumph gloriously." That I've just kind of highlighting it because I've touched on this. I've pulled those the Hebrew words there. You can see Gimel, Aleph, Hey. The vowel pointers on them are slightly different between the two words, but when they were originally written, there were no vowel pointers, so it's exactly the same word doubled up, ga'ah, which is a rarish word. It doesn't get used a huge amount, but we find it twice here in Moses' song and twice when Miriam does the same song. So we've kind of got it from there, and it's only used 3 times elsewhere. But it means something like risen or risen twice, so it's twice risen, risen, risen. So the NASB kind of goes for highly exalted. So the first one it's saying highly, second one exalted, so it's risen, risen. It's kind of the thinking. And I've just kind of demonstrated it by highlighting the other places it's used. So Ezekiel 47:5. So he measured out another 1,000 feet. We know this passage well, I guess. There's a river that I couldn't ford because the water had risen. It had gahad. It had gone up. Can the papyrus rise up without a marsh? In other words, can it grow up? You see the same idea. Can the rush grow without water? I dare not lift my head. Should I raise it up, you would hunt me like a lion, says Job. So these are the only other 3 places, but I just wanted to get across that word, as we know the song so well. Well, particularly I can remember singing it in kind of Sunday school situations, with the horse and riders thrown into the sea, because it's I will sing unto the Lord because He has triumphed gloriously. The horse and riders thrown in, you know the song. You don't have to make me sing it. Actually, no one did. I just did it. I did it for my pleasure, your pain. But I do like it's just really interesting to see. So they've come out. And they sing this song, and particularly when Miriam sings it, because obviously Miriam is the name Mary, and it sounds so much like when Mary comes and says, "I've seen the Lord, He's risen indeed, He really is there." And I can't help feeling this isn't a historical thing; it's more of this is the fingerprints of the Holy Spirit, just putting these little bits in, see if we can see them. I think He enjoys that kind of thing. the way that the Lord works in those ways. And it goes on actually. So Moses and all Israel sing, I'll sing to the Lord, he's risen, risen. And he goes on to sing, and the Lord is my salvation, which is literally is Jesus for me. It's Yeshua, T, with the T on the end. He's Jesus for me, which is a kind of a wonderful little kind of encoded, captured kind of sense of the gospel. Because I regularly say this, and I'll keep on saying it because I think it's an important. We all have a theologies of salvation, but for me, one of the key things is to see a consistency. I'm not a great fan of kind of the theology that says if you were born at this period, this is how you got saved. This is if you were born at this place, this is how you got saved. I think the thing that's consistent against them all is that we are saved in one sense by our response to the revelation we have of God's word, who is Jesus. And we have the privilege of sitting here, post AD, being able to say he was born under Pontius Pilate. Sorry, he was born under, born in the days of Herod, suffered under Pontius Pilate. We can say that because we have a great revelation. But in the Old Testament, they would just see him vaguely. He was far off, and but they were still responding to the same thing. And for me, it's quite that feels much more satisfactory than as some people do, and they talk about different dispensations. And if you were born in this dispensation, you had to do A, B, and C, and then you were really saved. If you got born in this one, you had to do that. And it gets a bit funny. So you even get to the things where if you were born, so I don't want to be rude, but people have argued like this. If you were born kind of when Jesus had started his ministry, but you died before the crucifixion, there's a separate thing for you that you needed to do to get saved. And it just gets so complicated. It doesn't feel. It feels lacking in grace. It feels like something about the consistency of God. There should be something that maybe feels different because we didn't have as much, but actually it's fundamentally drawing the same way. And I think you can see that regularly through the Old Testament. And very often we find Jesus' name is tucked into those passages where people express faith. So I've highlighted that before. We often see it as the word salvation. They're responding to God's salvation. But I almost wonder if the Holy Spirit has just got it in there like that so we can look at it and say, oh, that's the same name as Jesus. So this is all there. So this key moment, as they've come through, without realizing what they're even singing, they are acknowledging the place of Jesus. And from there, they go into the desert of Shur, which I've just highlighted the name on the map above. And the reason I put that picture underneath is because actually there are a number of kind of key routes across the top of the Sinai, and they're important to see because it's in terms of easy access and travel across. And they kind of are often referred to. It seems that they were referred to in different ways. Because the way of Shur is referred to elsewhere in Scripture. So the way of the Philistines is right there across the top. The way of Shur, which I think we've got. I haven't actually got the reference. I think it's the reference. Yeah, it's in. It's actually in Genesis where Hagar is returning to Egypt, and she's on the way. I think she's on the way of Shur. I think. Maybe wrong on that, but I think it refers to the way of Shur then, which would probably be this kind of route. And because obviously we can actually, there's a degree to which we can identify these because they're marked out by regular travel, and therefore there's things you can find from an archaeological point of view. And then the way of Arabia that runs from the top of the Gulf of Suez across to the top of the Gulf of Akbara. So we've got a couple of other references. So 1 Samuel is a reference to just but that's who is it who goes down? Yeah. Well, the key thing there, I think I was putting the highlight. I can't remember who's going down. Is that actually Shur is referred to as being just before Egypt? Al-Pana, which is the same word that we saw in the other one, the Panheros, which is part of the word for face. So it's an al means by it, or so it's next to the kind of presenting face of Egypt. So in other words, it's really close. It's not kind of on the way. It's right there next to it. And that this is what I mean when I was talking about why I think probably this is the place of the crossing rather than Gulf of Akbara, is because the Sinai kind of chunk although Egypt has interests in it, it's a much more fuzzy area, and whereas actually to describe the wilderness of Shur as being right by Egypt makes much more sense, kind of being here. And we also see here, this is from Abraham journeyed towards the south country, so he's coming down probably past the bottom of the Dead Sea, because he's now heading south, and dwell between Kadesh and Shur. So we'll think about Kadesh because we're going to finish there tonight. So he's gone further than Kadesh, but not quite as far as Shur, and it all kind of pushes the region of Shur into that same region at the top there of the Sinai kind of peninsula, and right next to Egypt. So that's where they find themselves. They've come through the sea, and they move into the wilderness, which probably implies that rather than running down the edge of the waterways which trace along the coast, they probably think, let's get away a little bit from Egypt, and they push into the desert. The only problem, of course, in doing that is they're not obviously quite sure what things are going to be like in the way of water. So it says Moses led Israel onward from the Red Sea. They went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness, but they couldn't find water. And then they came to Marah. And so it doesn't say it, but you can imagine a kind of a sense of, we're heading on out, we're hoping for water, we're not finding it. Does it mean they changed direction at all? How do those kind of things work? And they came to Marah, but they couldn't drink from the waters of Marah because they were bitter. So its name is called Marah. Now, if you remember from a few weeks ago, we saw those waterways. We saw one of the bits that still exists today is referred to as the Bitter Lake, because one of the things that typifies the waterways down that run that includes the canal is that they are very brackish chemically. So they have they've got mixed with a lot of salt water. A lot of salt has come up as the things have gone in, as the tides have come in over the years, and then there are also chemicals that been brought down from the hills, and so they are actually not very drinkable. So it's not surprising if they come to a location within that mix, that they're excited to drink from it because they've been out in the wilderness for 3 days, hardly finding anywhere. They come and they find open water, which is really encouraging, except that when they try and drink it, it's not that it's poisonous, but it is really, really undrinkable in a taste sort of way, and you probably wouldn't want to drink too much, otherwise it would make you sick. What have we got here? At the top of the Gulf of Suez, so just an interesting though, as you kind of come to the bottom end, therefore, of those kind of string of waterways which we've seen as probably the Reed Sea. And the Reed Sea would still be considered the Red Sea as it comes in, but at what we consider the top of the Suez Gulf, there is actually a region that's still called Bir el Mura, which is the bitter well, because even though it's a dug down well, the water that comes up out of the ground is still very salty. It's 65 miles south of Pihakiroth, which actually is about 3 days travel. They normally, as a working kind of average number for people on foot, they talk of 22 to 25 miles a day. The Bedouin shepherds can do up to 37 miles in a day, but that's when they have to push it. And we're talking about a big crowd. Now, that doesn't mean they're all walking at that speed, but you can kind of imagine if you're trying to say, well, roughly 3 days, if you've been tracing down, you've gone through the wilderness, if you're doing 25 miles an hour, that's 75, and it's only 65, but you've kind of dipped out into the wilderness of Shur. So you can imagine them coming towards the base of that region, finding kind of dug out wells, as even today the region is called the Bitter Well, and being thrilled that suddenly there's plenty of water, but when you get to try and taste it, it's still somewhat bitter. And then we have one of these interesting little true facts. I think the healing tree at Marah. You read, so Yahweh showed him a tree. This is Moses, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters were made sweet. And I put there. It's probably. This is more of a divine revelation than what you might consider a pure miracle. Because actually, I put this little note, English sailors, you find this in kind of old textbooks, is when you're travelling and you've only got salt water, what do? you throw a pound of charcoal into a barrel of salt water, and after an hour it's drinkable. So if the bitterness is to do with salt, then in actual fact, you can, if you throw a burnt tree into it, it does absorb salt. And it's something now that in Arabia, people in Arabia actually do. So they will actually burn it. Now, so if you imagine Moses, if you're coming down and he's looking around, and God says, notice over there, maybe there's been a bit of a bushfire or something, throw the thing in, throw in, maybe there's a few of them, and they throw them in, and they're just kind of the way it's described. And what we do know is it's still a miracle because it's revelation. Who on earth taught him to do this, if you see what I mean? But actually, if you buy your Brita water filter today and you look at the ingredients, it's still got charcoal in there, because charcoal, it's the chemical structure of burnt wood is such that it likes to suck up impurities from the water. As the water goes into it, it tries to go into the pores because it normally would try and absorb it. They kind of wedge in there, and the water kind of keeps on passing through, but it leaves the impurities stuck in the charcoal, you see. And so, and in particular, the acacia tree, which you find in wadis from Egypt to Arabia, is particularly effective as a water purifier. So in other words, part of the flora, I always do it the wrong way around, part of the flora of the region is particularly effective when burnt as a water purifier. So we don't read about Moses burning it, but maybe it was already a burnt tree standing there. All it says is God showed him a tree and he throws it in, and if it is a really big tree and he threw it in, then actually give it an hour or two and the water is starting to improve. But actually they don't stay there very long, and perhaps which is why I think it's not unreasonable if it is almost only one tree. You can imagine. Well, I think I've got a slide saying let's imagine the story as it unrolls. And so I just think, so a burnt acacia would work very well if you've got slightly salty water, which is what we seem to have here. It's not seawater, it's not super salty, but there's enough salt got into the water around that region that it's not really drinkable. But actually, burnt acacia does take the salt out of it, which means it becomes a bit more possible. Because of course, at this moment where they've complained about the bitter water, and God steps into this complaining. So God has done this incredible miracle. He's brought them through the sea. Pharaoh's army has been destroyed. They've headed onto the wilderness. Over 3 days of perhaps not finding water, they're getting a bit more downhearted. They get to the bitter water and start complaining. God shows Moses something to do, and as people are still kind of the trail end are kind of still turning up, the water is perhaps potentially getting slightly more drinkable if it's been dug up out of the ground. It's kind of something, therefore, it's just seeping into. But God kind of makes this promise, which is tied up with his name, Yahweh Rophi, I'm the Lord your healer. I've got the little comment in there, in the Septuagint, it doubles up the word ego and eime, which is something that Jesus does a lot when he talks about himself. It's like I am rather than just I am, if you double the two up. So God has said, I'm the God who heals you. And he makes a promise to them about how he'll save them from the diseases of the Israelites, of the Egyptians. They won't suffer those things. And kind of almost straight away, after doing that, it just says, and they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. And they encamped there by the waters. And it doesn't have any travel time. It's just they've come to Marah. It's bitter. They're complaining. Moses is shown a tree. He puts it in, and somehow it seems to improve the flavour. And God says, "I'm going to be your healer, and you're not going to have any of these kind of problems." And straight away it says they came to Elim, which actually just 9 miles south of the place called the Bitter Well, which is at that top end, where even when you dig down, you're still getting bitter water out. We find the Bir El Mura, 9 miles south of the Bitter Well, which is Bir El Mura, is the Iron Musa, which is one of just 2 locations in Sinai in Arabia that's actually got Moses' name in it. It's remembered as being related to Moses, which actually means the springs of Moses. Now, historically, when I say historically, I mean if you take 100 years ago, people dismissed this as being the location of Elim because they were looking at the crossing of the Red Sea as being the Red Sea proper. You see, and if they've crossed the Red Sea proper and then headed south, they're never going to get there. You see, so they ignored the fact that the place is called the Springs of Moses. But actually, if we've taken this other route where it's gone up higher, they've actually come down south. It's the right distance from what they've been described as travelling. And actually at the Springs of Moses, there's a huge underground aquifer which actually washes most of the salt out. So there's a very small amount of salt, but actually a small amount of salt in water is actually quite pleasant. I remember a friend who was a missionary in I can't remember who it was, as a child. He's an older man. He died now. He's if anyone, he was actually a close friend of Watchman Nee, among other things. But he himself was in India, I think, rather than in China. But one of those kind of people that you meet that's just spent their whole life. and I remember him saying, as a child growing up in India, how they used to drop tablets of salt into just enough water because actually it was so much more refreshing than without it.
They do it with a lime and salt.
Mm.
Now you get in hotels now with soda water.
Soda water and lime, yeah.
Because you need the salts.
Because you lose it, yeah, yeah.
And British troops used to have salt tablets.
Salt tablets, yeah. So what I'm saying is the actual springs here are actually considered, although they've still got a slight amount of saltiness, because they've been so much washed through by this totally freshwater aquifer. So it's the same kind of table of water, but it's got this huge amount of fresh water coming through. It makes it apparently very, very drinkable. And according and there are today scores still of palm trees in the region. I've got this Egyptologist, a guy called Gregory Mumford, who actually makes the claim that you can actually identify 12 wells that have been drilled, probably before Moses gets there, but at times there have been 12 deliberate boreholes put into this aquifer to bring the water up. And that goes right the way back to ancient times. So it actually is a very good description if there really were 12. But you also, of course, it brings in an interesting dynamic, which is the combination of 12 and 70, which actually is a kind of a regular one that runs through Jewish history. So 12 for governance and kind of 70, which is kind of the wider leadership. And so you have the 12 and the 70 here at the beginning of Exodus. Towards the end, when they go up the mountain with Moses, 70 of the elders go up with him, representing the 12 tribes. So you get the same combination of 12 and 70. But that doesn't mean to say that the 12 is therefore just a totally symbolic number, because, sorry, that's my phone. For some reason, it does. One day I'll work out why it makes certain noises. Every now and again, it makes this dramatic sound as if I've done something important. But at this stage, you can see how if we're being told that there really were 12 boreholes, so it's not just a symbolic number, and there are 12 tribes, that kind of actually this is quite exciting. We've got 12 tribes, and there's a hole for each of us. There's a well for each of us. There's a borehole for each of us. And look, we look around and count them, and maybe there's 70 that are actually full grown or whatever, however you do it. But they identified, you know what, and there's 70, and that's kind of fits some of the tribal eldership, which was going to see continues the idea of 70-72. Which, of course, comes right the way into Jesus' own ministry. He starts with 12 and expands to the 70/72. We find it again at the time when the Septuagint is translated, where it's 70 or 72 elders. It's kind of the same combination of those numbers. And here we get it for the first time right at the beginning. And it's very much tied to the grace of God, if you think of it like this, because, one, they've come through miraculous salvation, but now there's provision as well. So they got to Marah, and God said, don't worry, I'm going to look after you. I'll be your healer. There's a tree that goes in to make the bitter waters, but actually, almost by accident, probably some of the forerunner crowd have gone forward a few miles and come back saying, so I think I've actually put this on a slide. It's a kind of a putting it together. Yes, so the vanguard's arriving at Marah. They encounter the bitter water. There's still a slow trail kind of coming in. They're still arriving. Moses' attention is drawn to some burnt acacia trees, and he has them collected and thrown into the water. And as they're just steeping in there, over the next hour or so, they start to absorb some of the saltiness, which does make them drinkable. And so as people are arriving, there's at least something to drink, having been out without water for 3 days. That's the impression we've got. They've perhaps taken water with them, but they've not been able to find any to replenish it. So they're desperate for something, and they're getting that at Marah now because it's been made sweet. But in the meantime, there's probably scouts going on ahead of them, and they come back to say we only need to travel a little bit further south, because it doesn't even describe it as taking a single day. It just says they came to Elim. They got to Marah, God heals the water, and the next thing they're in Elim, you see, so it's that close. They come back saying you only have to go a little bit further, and actually there's plenty of really fresh water, and there's date palms as well. And so the whole congregation move on for just a few more hours worth of walking, and they're in a wonderful kind of, we can now breathe easily, we can actually relax for a few days, which must have been a wonderful feeling. And it's been tied, if you like, with a word from God and a miracle from God to say, I am going to look after you. You came to the bitter waters, and I showed you a way of making it sweet. But even before you, just as you're kind of refreshing yourselves with them, you discovered there's a fantastic source a few miles to the south. So this whole run of time, if you stop and think about it, it's taken roughly 7 to 10 days. They've left. Remember that Passover has happened, so it's on the 14th, 15th, the evening of the 14th into the 15th. The next day they've left. They've gathered at Sukkoth. We don't know how many days they're there, but we were thinking that people seem to have come from a bit wider, because we've got the evidence of the abandoned workman's village, the Asiatics leaving that around that period. So perhaps they've stationed there for a day or so. So we had a day to kind of get there, as a day or two while they're there. Then they've taken a day's kind of walking up, and they've gone past Etam, which is probably on the border, and they come to the top, so maybe another 2 days there. So we've gone 1 day, 2 days, 2 days, so we're up to about 5 days. Then they've done 3 days into the wilderness, and then 3 days after that, they're down in Elim, so that's why that's 8 days in that sense. The quickest I think you're likely to be able to do it is 7 days, but 10 days would feel too long. Does that make sense? And the reason I'm saying that is because we do have some timings. It's just, as we'll see, the timings kind of work too, and they imply something. I don't know, I might be totally wrong. It's just when I was doing this slide earlier, I suddenly thought, I wonder if it's 7 days, because they're told to eat unleavened bread for 7 days, aren't they? After. I wonder if that somehow relates to the fact that they're kind of in that, it's in travel food mode. We're eating the bread we took with us. And they're supposed to have cooked it as unleavened because they had to clear it all out. So are they eating unleavened bread for those 7 days in the trip down to get to Elim? Does that make sense? So it's just a thought. There might be something somewhere in the Bible that contradicts that, but I was just thinking that when I was doing the slide, which gives us about 3 weeks later before they arrive in the wilderness of Sin. It's always that wonderful description. I can't do the Scottish accent like Howard was doing it earlier when you were saying your bendy Bible. Whoever talked to you about your bendy Bible probably loves the wilderness of sin. Are you lost in the wilderness of sin?
She probably did.
So yeah. But in the meantime, so that they're there in Elim. We don't know how many days they stay. We just know that 3 weeks later, because it's exactly 1 month after they've left Egypt, and Hebrew months are 29 or 30 days there because they're lunar months. So 7 to 10 days. So it's about 3 weeks later. We know that they're in a place called the Wilderness of Sin. But Numbers gives us some steps on that journey, so we can kind of follow it a little bit more. So it says they travelled from Elim and encamped by the Red Sea, and they travelled from the Red Sea or the Reed Sea and encamped in the Wilderness of Sin. So there's a step. There's Elim, there's an encampment that they make by the Red or the Reed Sea, and then the next thing we know, they're in the Wilderness of Sin, and it's taken them. We've got 3 weeks to do the journey, so we've got plenty of time. They're not rushing wherever they go. So Elim is near the Gulf of Suez, as we've said. So I've got the bigger map there. Gulf of Aqaba over the other side is also surrounded by reeds because of the way that things come down, and is referred to as the Reed Sea in 1 Kings. So Solomon actually has some ships stationed there, and you can tell very clearly that it's in the Gulf of Aqaba, and he calls it the Sea of Reeds, same word, Yim Suf. The Septuagint calls it the Red Sea again. It's the same kind of combination. So on that basis, if Mount Sinai is in Arabia, it would make sense that actually they've kind of cut across, which you can do because actually it's kind of relatively flat across that top part of the Sinai Peninsula. It gets really mountainous towards the kind of the bottom of the V shape, and traditionally if you like the kind of the traditional site of Mount Sinai is in the mountain regions down in the south, but this top bit is flatter and is relatively easy to cut straight across. So it's not at all inappropriate to think of they travel from Elim and encamp by the Reed Sea could actually be the top of the Gulf of Aqaba. And that would make sense if we are looking at Mount Sinai being in Arabia on that volcanic ridge. If we're not, then it probably means that they've kind of come down to some further point where they've gone inland for a bit and then come back out and touch the Red Sea kind of a bit further south. But I'm just kind of highlighting it. So that little stump of red kind of running into Arabia is because I'm not at this point saying exactly where they get to, just saying they keep on going. It's a kind of it becomes a good marker point. It's the only point we know between the two. So it would take less than a week to the Gulf of Aqaba, then some more days to get beyond it. As I said, the Israelites probably have taken time in Elim, and then they get to the wilderness of Sin, and we get a number of steps before we get to Sinai, from Sin to Sinai. I've put the kind of question: can we be any more precise then about the wilderness of Sin, with a question mark, which normally means we'll have a go. Whether you're convinced or not is another matter. But we can have a go, see if we can say anything a bit more.
Is the word Sinai related to sin?
I think it is. And when we looked at the week when Moses has the encounter with God on Sinai, we looked at the fact. So in fact, we're doing this after the break. Can we get more precise than sin? But just to answer the question Andrew's asking, Sinai. It's not universally accepted, but there's a strong kind of consensus that if you look at all of the region in Arabia, and it spilled a little bit round to the top and into Sinai, then actually the main kind of pagan cult is of the moon, and that makes sense. And of course, even in Arabia today, the crescent moon is the thing, and that goes right the way back. And so Jethro, as a priest of Midian, is a priest of the moon god, who is interestingly represented as a calf very often, because before a calf's horns become curly, they make a nice kind of crescent moon shape on the top of the head. So it was kind of seen as an animal with a crescent moon on its head, the calf. And so when at Sinai, the fact that Aaron thinks to make a calf as their a golden calf as their symbol of God is because actually as they've been approaching, that's part of the thinking. Now the reason for saying all that is because the Assyrian name for the moon god is Sin, and Sinai is thought to be of Sin. So Sin and Sinai are thought therefore to be connected. Now, the moon god is not called anything like that down in Arabia, but it's thought that they may have the remembrance of the fact it's a moon god, and as they've moved further north into Canaan, the way that's easiest to remember it and communicate it is it's the wilderness of the sin of the moon god and the mountain of the moon god, and the way that everybody knows the moon god is now Sin. So we've kind of transposed one name and applied it back. I quite like that as a working kind of theory. It's not accepted by everyone, but it kind of makes sense of the fact that archaeologically you can dig up calf shrines all over that region of Arabia, and we do know that that's exactly what the Israelites do themselves, and the calf shrines are for the moon god, and we know that the moon god eventually becomes known by the name Sin. So I think they are. But it's probably something about the whole region as we're kind of getting into it. So we'll take a break. we've got a few less slides. I think we did 17 on this one. I think 13 in section 2. But there's a lot that can be said in between the slides because I ran out of time doing slides.